Coda slammed both palms against the packed earth, but the silverback was not looking at the visitors. His shoulders were squared toward a narrow cluster of logs near the back wall, while his head kept turning toward the glass as if the movement outside was making something worse. A stroller stopped mid-roll. Phones lowered. Near the front rail, Lauren Reed pulled her 8-year-old son closer when Coda released a low, pulsing grunt and shifted sideways, placing his entire body between the crowd and whatever lay behind him. For several seconds, the enclosure went strangely quiet. Then Coda did something Lauren had never seen a gorilla do during any of her visits. He scraped a wide strip of loose mulch toward the logs and pressed it down with the side of his hand. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. By early afternoon, families had filled the viewing area of the wildlife park, carrying paper cups, folded maps, and half-finished snacks from the cafe. Nothing about the day had seemed unusual until Coda abandoned the shaded platform where keepers had scattered his enrichment food. Now sliced vegetables remained untouched nearly 40 feet away while the 400-pound silverback stayed beside the same cluster of logs. Lauren initially assumed the crowd had irritated him. So did several visitors who quietly backed away. But when the noise dropped, Coda did not relax. Instead, he leaned toward the ground and held perfectly still. His ear turned slightly. Then came a faint sound from somewhere behind him, too soft for Lauren to identify. Coda immediately shifted closer to the logs. A radio crackled behind the visitors. Senior keeper Rachel Morgan had arrived at the barrier and was studying Coda without approaching the service entrance. She asked everyone to give the glass more space. Coda watched the retreating people, breathing steadily, and for a moment his posture softened. That seemed to confirm the obvious explanation: he wanted the crowd gone. But then a maintenance cart passed on a service road behind the enclosure. Coda spun toward the sound, moved 3 quick steps, and planted himself in exactly the same place again. Rachel stopped speaking. If the visitors were the problem, why was he guarding one patch of ground? She raised her radio and requested that the viewing area be temporarily cleared. Lauren began guiding her son toward the exit when he tugged her sleeve. "Mom, why does he keep looking down?" She turned back. Coda had crouched beside the logs, one arm resting across the opening between them. He was no longer displaying toward anyone. His fingers slowly gathered dry leaves and pulled them toward the gap. Rachel noticed it too. She moved several feet along the barrier, trying to change her viewing angle. Coda tracked her movement immediately, not by following her along the enclosure, but by repositioning himself so she still could not see behind him. That changed the mood. This no longer looked like random agitation. Coda appeared to be deliberately controlling access to something. Rachel spoke into her radio again, this time asking staff not to open the nearby service gate. Almost on cue, metal clicked somewhere beyond the wall as another keeper approached from the restricted corridor. Coda rose to his full height. A sharp grunt carried across the enclosure. The keeper stopped. Coda waited until the footsteps retreated, then lowered himself again. Lauren felt her son tighten his grip on her hand. Whatever Coda was doing, he seemed far more concerned about someone entering than anyone leaving. Rachel crouched near the glass and looked beneath the lowest log. At first there was only mulch, shadow, and a strip of dark soil. Then something moved. Not Coda. Not a branch. From the narrow darkness behind his arm, a tiny set of fingers appeared for less than a second, curled around the edge of the wood, and vanished. Rachel stood so quickly that her radio slipped against her jacket. "Close the service gate," she said. This time her voice carried an urgency that made every staff member nearby stop. Coda turned toward her, then reached behind the logs with extraordinary care, and something hidden there answered him with a thin, trembling sound. Coda kept his arm behind the logs for several seconds, then drew it back and settled onto the ground. The change was so quiet that Lauren almost missed it. His shoulders lowered. His fingers rested loosely in the mulch. Rachel remained near the glass, watching the silverback without making another move toward the service gate. She knew Coda had small habits that were easy to overlook. At this hour he usually searched the grass for whatever pieces of produce had been missed during feeding, turning each one over before eating it. Today, a bright slice of bell pepper sat untouched in plain view. Coda glanced toward it once, then returned his attention to the hidden space beside him. Rachel had seen him ignore food before, but never like this. A keeper farther down the corridor quietly rolled a familiar blue enrichment barrel into view, hoping its presence might draw Coda several feet away without forcing the issue. The barrel normally held scattered treats that fell through small openings when it was turned. Coda looked directly at it. His fingers even flexed against the ground, as though an old routine had briefly taken over. Then the faint sound came again. Coda lowered his head and remained where he was. The blue barrel rolled to a stop by itself. Rachel exchanged a look with the keeper. Something mattered more to Coda than the routine he rarely passed up. The last visitors were being guided toward the exit, and the enclosure grew calmer. Lauren had nearly reached the doors when her son looked back and stopped. Coda was picking through the leaves beside the logs, but he was not searching for food. He selected a broad piece of bark, turned it once in his hand, and placed it near the opening. Then he chose another. There was nothing hurried about the movement. It looked almost ordinary until Rachel noticed where every piece was going. Coda was leaving the center of the gap open while covering the exposed edges. Whatever was behind those logs, he seemed unwilling to block it completely. Lauren and her son were asked to remain behind a secondary barrier while staff worked. From there, they could still see Coda through the glass. Without the crowd, the silverback appeared less imposing and strangely tired. He sat with one shoulder against the wood, occasionally rubbing a thumb across the dusty surface before pausing to listen. Once, he reached toward a shallow water basin only a few feet away, stopped halfway, and returned his hand to the ground. Rachel noticed that too. His water was close. His food was close. The shaded platform was close. Yet Coda behaved as though moving even that short distance was not worth the risk. Several minutes passed before he finally changed position. He rose, walked toward the basin, and Lauren expected him to drink. Instead, Coda dipped the back of his fingers into the water and returned almost immediately. He crouched near the logs and touched the damp hand to the soil beside the hidden opening. Rachel leaned closer to the glass. She could not tell whether the gesture meant anything or whether Coda had simply carried water back by accident, but his attention never left that spot. Then his eyes moved toward the empty upper platform across the enclosure. He stared there longer than before. Rachel followed his gaze. One member of the guerrilla group who should normally have been visible nearby was nowhere in sight. A soft call came from deeper inside the habitat. Coda lifted his head at once. He did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the logs and made a low sound, quieter than anything Lauren had heard from him that afternoon. For the first time, the sound from behind the wood answered almost immediately. Rachel reached for her radio but stopped when Coda shifted aside just enough to expose a few inches of ground. There, pressed into the damp soil beneath the lowest log, was a fresh drag mark leading toward the narrow opening. Beside it was a footprint much smaller than Coda's. Rachel stared at it, then looked across the enclosure again. A second call echoed from somewhere out of sight. This time Coda stood, faced the direction of the call, and answered with a deep rumble. From behind the logs came another tiny sound, followed by the unmistakable movement of the wood itself. The wood shifted again, but Coda did not touch it. Rachel raised one hand toward the staff corridor, signaling everyone to stay where they were. Coda moved several feet to his left, pressed his knuckles into the soil, and began following the edge of the log pile instead of guarding its opening. At first, Rachel wondered whether he was searching for another way behind it. Then he stopped beside a narrow drainage grate, brushed away a layer of mulch, and listened. His attention had moved from the hidden gap to something beneath the ground. That changed the problem entirely. Dr. Caleb Brooks arrived through the staff corridor carrying a small field bag, but Rachel kept him behind the secondary gate while she explained what they had observed. Caleb watched Coda walk from the grate to the logs and back again. There was no obvious limp, no unsteady movement, and no sign that he was confused about his surroundings. When Coda reached the grate a second time, however, he placed both hands on the ground beside it and gave two short grunts. A softer sound seemed to answer from the direction of the logs. Caleb stopped taking notes. Whatever Coda was reacting to appeared to involve more than one point in the enclosure. Rachel asked another keeper to check the habitat map in the office. While they waited, Coda moved toward a length of old climbing rope hanging from a wooden structure about 15 feet away. He tugged it loose from the ground, carried the free end back, and dropped it beside the logs. Lauren could see Rachel studying the rope with a puzzled expression. Coda did not play with it. He did not pull it toward himself again. He simply left it there, then walked around the log pile and tested the soil with his knuckles in 3 different places. The possibility that he was merely defending an object no longer seemed to fit. The keeper returned with a laminated site plan. Rachel and Caleb unfolded it on a utility cart beyond the glass. The drainage grate Coda had uncovered connected to an older runoff channel that passed beneath part of the habitat. It was not large enough for an adult gorilla, and maintenance records showed no reported problem with it. Rachel looked up from the map just as Coda began pushing loose mulch away from one side of the lowest log. That seemed encouraging until he abruptly stopped, covered the same patch again, and moved to the opposite side. Caleb frowned. Coda appeared to be testing routes and rejecting them. Staff lowered the noise around the habitat even further. A grounds crew shut off a nearby utility vehicle, radios were turned down, and the remaining visitors stayed well behind the barrier. With the mechanical hum gone, another sound became noticeable, a faint tapping beneath the heavier log, followed by silence. Coda responded differently this time. He moved away rather than closer, climbed halfway onto a low platform, and looked across the enclosure toward an indoor access door. Rachel wondered whether he was finally ready to leave the area. She quietly asked the keeper to prepare the indoor space. The moment the latch moved, Coda came down from the platform and returned to the logs. Now Rachel had another contradiction. He seemed to want distance from the hidden spot, but he would not allow the routine that might take him away from it. Caleb suggested they avoid making another change until they understood the pattern. Coda circled once, paused beside the rope he had carried over, and picked it up again. This time he threaded part of it between 2 logs, released it, then moved around to the far side and pulled gently. The rope slid through the gap before catching against something beneath the wood. Coda stopped immediately. He lowered himself onto his forearms and listened. A small movement came from below. Lauren felt her son press closer beside her, but neither spoke. Coda backed away several feet, gathered a thick armful of dry bedding from beneath the platform, and carried it to the log pile. Rachel expected him to place it beside the opening as he had done with the bark. Instead, Coda pushed the entire bundle into a shallow depression near the drainage grate, packed it down with both hands, then sat beside it. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the soil at the edge of the depression shifted downward by nearly an inch. Rachel immediately reached for her radio. Coda rose before she could speak, moved to the largest log, wrapped both hands around the rope he had positioned moments earlier, and pulled just enough to make the log roll a fraction of an inch. He released it at once. A narrow opening appeared beneath it. Coda lowered his face toward the gap, made the quietest rumble they had heard from him all afternoon, then turned his body sideways and planted himself directly between the opening and the staff entrance, as if whatever came next could happen only if no human moved closer. Rachel kept everyone behind the service entrance while Caleb studied the narrow opening Coda had created. The safest option was becoming difficult to ignore. If the ground near the drainage channel was unstable, staff could not enter while a 400-pound silverback remained beside it. Coda would need to move into the indoor holding area first. It was standard procedure, calm and reversible, and under ordinary circumstances Rachel would not have hesitated. Yet Coda was sitting with one hand beside the opening, his attention fixed on the faint sounds beneath the logs. Moving him now felt less like clearing a workspace and more like asking him to abandon something he believed required him there. Caleb understood the concern, but he also pointed toward the fresh depression near the grate. The soil had shifted again. If a buried section of the old runoff channel had weakened, additional weight could make access harder. They needed maintenance staff to inspect it before daylight faded. Rachel agreed. She asked a keeper to prepare Coda's indoor room with familiar bedding and fresh produce, hoping routine would do what pressure could not. The sliding door opened in the distance. Coda heard it immediately. For one hopeful moment, he stood and took 2 steps toward it. Then a soft tapping came from behind him. He stopped without turning around. His hand remained suspended above the ground before he slowly returned to the logs. Rachel tried the usual transfer cue from outside the enclosure. Coda recognized it, that much was obvious. He glanced toward the open doorway, then toward Rachel, then lowered himself beside the gap. There was no frantic display and no challenge. He simply refused to leave. That made the situation harder, not easier. A confused animal might be redirected. Coda appeared to have made a choice. Mark Ellis joined Rachel near the utility cart and quietly reminded her that the park would soon enter its late afternoon staffing transition. If an inspection was necessary, they needed enough trained people on site to complete it safely. Waiting indefinitely could create a second problem. Rachel knew he was right. Still, when she looked through the glass, Coda had begun gathering several pieces of bedding closer to the opening, almost as though preparing to remain there for a long time. The staff tried another low-pressure approach. They placed several of Coda's preferred food items just inside the indoor doorway and stepped away. No one called him. No one moved toward him. For nearly a minute, Coda watched the open entrance. Then he rose and walked halfway across the enclosure. Lauren felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps he would go inside on his own, allowing staff to inspect the area and finally understand what had been troubling him. But halfway there, Coda stopped beside the untouched blue barrel. He turned his head toward the logs. A barely audible sound carried across the quiet habitat. Coda immediately walked back. Caleb exhaled and closed his field bag. They were running out of voluntary options. Rachel asked whether they could inspect the drainage system from outside the habitat instead. A maintenance worker checked the plans and found an exterior access point, but it would only reveal the downstream section. It could not show what was happening directly beneath Coda's position. Still, Rachel sent 2 workers to check it. Minutes later, her radio came alive. The channel was partially obstructed, and moisture had collected where it should have drained freely. That did not explain the sounds, but it confirmed that the ground near the logs could not simply be assumed stable. Rachel looked at Coda again. His strange behavior had led them to a real problem, yet solving that problem required removing him from the very place he refused to leave. Mark suggested postponing any physical inspection until morning, but Caleb shook his head. Overnight rain was forecast, and even a modest amount of water could worsen the saturated soil. Waiting might be the greater risk. No one liked the conclusion, but each piece of information pointed toward the same decision. Rachel requested the animal care supervisor by radio and explained the situation carefully. After several minutes of discussion, authorization came back. They would make one final attempt at a voluntary transfer. If Coda still refused, the veterinary team would use the park's established temporary separation protocol so the area could be examined safely. Rachel lowered the radio. Across the enclosure, Coda reached one hand into the narrow opening, paused as another faint sound answered him, and settled closer to the logs. Behind Rachel, Mark quietly closed the public viewing doors. The final transfer attempt would begin in 10 minutes. Rachel delayed the final transfer attempt when the maintenance worker returned with a photograph from the exterior access point. The runoff channel was not completely blocked. A mat of damp leaves and fibrous plant material had collected against one side, leaving a narrow path where water could still pass. Caleb enlarged the image on the worker's phone. Nothing in it explained Coda's behavior, but one detail weakened their newest theory: the obstruction looked recent and light, not severe enough to account for the movement beneath the logs. Rachel glanced through the glass. Coda had left the opening again, but this time he was tracing a slow path along the edge of the landscaped mound. He stopped at one spot and pressed his knuckles into the soil. Then he moved 3 feet and did the same thing again. Caleb asked for the habitat inspection records. A keeper brought them from the office along with the daily animal location sheet. Rachel spread both across the utility cart. The drainage line had been inspected 6 weeks earlier with no structural concerns recorded. Recent rain had softened the upper soil, but there had been no reported collapse. That made a major underground failure less likely. Then Rachel noticed something on the location sheet. The gorilla group had been counted normally before lunch, but the afternoon check had never been completed because staff attention had shifted to Coda. She did not say what she was thinking. Instead, she asked for the camera archive from the previous hour. The security monitor showed ordinary activity at first: visitors passing the glass, gorillas moving through patches of shade, leaves stirring in a light breeze. Rachel advanced the recording slowly. Coda appeared near the center of the habitat, then disappeared behind the climbing structure. Several minutes later he returned at a faster pace and went directly toward the logs. Caleb leaned closer. Rachel rewound the footage. This time they watched the area before Coda arrived. A patch of tall grass moved near the mound. It could have been another gorilla passing behind it. It could have been wind. The camera angle offered no clear answer. Rachel switched to a second view. For less than a second, something pale brown appeared between 2 logs and vanished. Caleb asked her to freeze the frame. The image blurred when enlarged. It might have been bark. It might have been a hand. There was not enough detail to tell. Outside, Coda had returned to the rope. Instead of pulling it, he laid the loose end beside the opening and pushed it forward several inches. Then he waited. Nothing happened. He retrieved it and tried from a slightly different angle. Rachel watched with growing concentration. Coda was not repeating himself randomly. Each attempt changed by a small amount, as though the result of the previous one mattered. That observation made Caleb reconsider the temporary separation. He asked Rachel for 5 more minutes before they began. She agreed. They muted every radio nearby and listened. The enclosure settled into an unnatural stillness. Air moved through the trees. Somewhere beyond the building, a delivery truck backed up with a distant electronic beep. Coda crouched near the mound. Then came 3 soft taps from the hidden space. A pause followed. 2 more taps came several seconds later. Caleb looked toward the drainage plan, wondering whether water or loose debris could be producing the pattern. Rachel did not answer. She was watching the security monitor again. On the recording, a female gorilla crossed the upper section of the habitat shortly before Coda reached the logs. Rachel recognized Nala immediately. She moved out of frame, returned less than a minute later, and paused near the mound before leaving again. That behavior could mean almost anything. Rachel advanced the footage frame by frame. At the edge of the picture, the grass bent downward. Something smaller seemed to pass behind it, but the image disappeared beneath the camera's timestamp. Caleb checked the current habitat and quietly asked where Nala was now. A keeper located her near the indoor side of the enclosure. She was calm, but she had been giving occasional contact calls. Rachel looked from Nala's location to Coda, then back to the frozen video. The pieces still refused to form a complete picture. Soil movement suggested one problem. The drainage channel suggested another. Coda's careful use of the rope suggested something else entirely. Rachel was about to restart the footage when Lauren's son, still waiting behind the secondary barrier, pointed toward the monitor. "Can you go back?" he asked softly. Rachel rewound 5 seconds. The boy pointed again. Near the bottom corner of the frame, almost hidden behind Coda's leg, was a tiny muddy print. It had 5 distinct toes. Rachel enlarged the muddy print until its outline filled the monitor. Caleb leaned closer, then looked through the glass toward the mound. The print was far too small to belong to Coda, and its position on the recording placed it near the logs shortly before his behavior changed. Rachel pulled up the earlier camera angle again. Nala crossed the habitat. The grass moved behind her. A smaller shape followed, disappeared near the landscaped mound, and never appeared on the other side. Rachel felt the pieces align at once. "Poppy," she said quietly. The 8-month-old gorilla was missing from the afternoon count. Caleb immediately stopped the transfer procedure. No one opened the service gate. Instead, they reviewed every camera angle available, looking for a safe way to confirm what the footage suggested without disturbing the unstable ground. One low camera near the far side of the habitat showed only a few inches beneath the lowest log, but when Rachel adjusted the playback position, a small movement appeared in the darkness. A hand reached forward, touched the soil, and withdrew. It was the same tiny hand Lauren had glimpsed earlier. Poppy was underneath the edge of the mound. The old drainage channel had not collapsed completely. Soft soil beside it had settled around a shallow pocket between the buried channel wall and the landscaping logs. Poppy had apparently moved into that space before the ground shifted enough to make the opening difficult to climb through. She was not visible from the visitor side, and the logs had hidden her from most cameras. Coda had found her long before the staff understood what had happened. Every strange action now changed meaning. He had not been guarding territory. He had been staying beside Poppy. The mulch he scraped toward the logs had covered loose edges around the opening. The bark and bedding had been placed where the soil was softest. When he pressed his knuckles into different points along the mound, he had been responding to movement beneath the surface. Even the rope made sense. Coda had not been playing with it. He had tested the log from different angles and stopped whenever the movement beneath it changed. Caleb looked at the depression beside the drainage grate and understood why Coda had packed bedding there. The soil had been sinking. Adding loose material had changed the surface beneath his own weight while he remained close enough to hear Poppy. The water on his fingers, the repeated listening, the refusal to move toward the indoor room, even his reaction to the service gate all belonged to the same pattern. Koda had never been trying to keep people away from himself. He had been preventing sudden activity around a hidden infant in unstable ground. Rachel felt a knot form in her throat when she remembered how close they had come to separating him from the area. Their decision had been reasonable based on what they knew, but Koda had known one thing they did not. Someone small was down there. Another contact call traveled from the indoor side of the habitat. Nala. This time the response from beneath the logs was clear enough that everyone heard it. A soft infant vocalization came through the opening. Nala called again, and Poppy answered. Koda did not pound the ground or rush toward the sound. He simply lowered himself beside the opening and gave a quiet rumble of his own. Poppy's fingers appeared beneath the log. Koda placed the back of his hand against the soil a few inches away, leaving space between them. The tiny fingers moved forward until they rested against one of his knuckles. Rachel lowered her radio without speaking. Lauren's son pressed both hands against his chest, watching through the glass. For hours, everyone had been trying to understand what Koda wanted. Now the answer was resting in the dirt beside him. He had not changed his mind once. They had only finally learned how to read it. Rachel kept her eyes on the two hands near the opening, one massive and dusted with soil, the other small enough to disappear behind a single knuckle. A few minutes earlier, she had been preparing to move Koda away. Now she could not stop thinking about how carefully he had refused. She reached toward the transfer checklist clipped to the utility cart, removed it, and folded it once before setting it aside. Caleb noticed but said nothing. Across the glass, Koda remained almost motionless. Poppy withdrew her fingers into the darkness. Koda waited, then gave the same low rumble. A moment later, the little hand returned. Mark walked to the viewing doors and turned the lock without making an announcement. There was no reason to let anyone else inside yet. When he came back, he picked up the temporary closure sign he had prepared earlier. The printed notice described Koda as displaying unusual agitation. Mark read the sentence for several seconds, then turned the sign face down on the counter. Lauren watched him do it. She took out her phone and opened the short video she had recorded when Koda first began blocking the area. Her unfinished caption was still there, "Angry gorilla at the glass." She stared at the words, erased them, and slipped the phone into her pocket. Her son looked up at her. He was helping her the whole time. Lauren nodded, but her voice took a moment to arrive. He was staying with her. Inside the habitat, Koda shifted his weight when Poppy made another soft sound. He did not reach into the opening. He simply moved closer, leaving his hand where she could find it again. That restraint affected Caleb more than any dramatic gesture could have. He had spent the afternoon evaluating Koda's posture, movement, breathing, and responses as possible signs of stress. Now he watched the silverback deliberately remain within reach without crowding the trapped infant. Caleb closed the notebook in his hand. On the last page were several observations he had written earlier, including one word followed by a question mark, territorial. He drew a single line through it. Rachel asked a keeper to bring Nala closer to the protected section of the habitat without opening access to the unstable area. When Nala appeared beyond the partition, Koda lifted his head. She gave a short contact call. Poppy answered from beneath the logs, louder this time. Nala moved to the barrier and sat down. Koda looked toward her, then back at the opening. There was no dramatic exchange between the adults, only a quiet awareness that changed the room. Lauren's son reached for his mother's hand again, but this time he was not frightened. He was watching Poppy's fingers appear beside Koda's. Rachel stepped away from the glass and pressed her palms against the edge of the utility cart. She had worked around gorillas long enough to know better than to turn their behavior into human motives. Koda did not need to be given a heroic speech or a human explanation. What mattered was visible in what he had done. He had heard Poppy stayed close, tested the unstable area, and resisted every attempt that would have taken him away. Rachel looked at Caleb and spoke quietly. "We almost separated him from her." Caleb glanced toward Coda. "But we did not." It was not absolution. It was simply the truth, and for the moment it was enough. The staff began preparing a safer plan, moving slowly and speaking in low voices. Coda watched them but did not leave Poppy. When Rachel passed the blue enrichment barrel that had been rolled out earlier, she noticed a piece of apple still lying beside it. She picked up the barrel and moved it out of the work path. Hours ago, Coda had ignored it, and that small choice had seemed troubling. Now it felt like one of the clearest things he had told them. Through the glass, Poppy made another quiet call. Coda answered. Then, for the first time since the viewing area had been closed, Nala answered too. The three sounds came from different places, separated by wood, soil, and a safety partition, but close enough to form a gentle exchange. Nobody in the room spoke over it. The first change came from Coda himself. Once the habitat was quiet and the staff stopped trying to draw him away, the tension in his posture eased. He remained beside Poppy, but his movements became slower. Rachel and Caleb worked from the maintenance plans while another keeper positioned a portable camera near the safest edge of the mound. The image showed enough open space around Poppy for them to avoid moving the heavy logs directly. Instead, they could clear loose soil from an exterior maintenance opening connected to the old channel. It would take longer, but Coda would not have to be forced away. Rachel looked through the glass before approving the plan. Coda was listening to Poppy again. The maintenance crew began removing damp debris by hand from the outside access point. Every few minutes they stopped so Rachel could check the camera. Nothing was rushed. As the pressure around the shallow pocket decreased, a little more daylight appeared near Poppy. Coda noticed before anyone announced it. He lowered his head toward the opening, then moved back several inches. It was the first time all afternoon that he had voluntarily created more space between himself and the logs. Caleb saw it and quietly asked the crew to continue at the same pace. Coda seemed to be telling them something again, only now they were finally patient enough to notice. Nearly 40 minutes later, Poppy could move both arms freely. Nala remained nearby behind the safety partition, answering whenever the infant called. The staff widened the safe opening without entering Coda's immediate space. Then Poppy's face appeared between the logs. Dirt covered one cheek, and bits of dry grass clung to the fur above her forehead. She paused there, blinking at the late afternoon light. Coda leaned forward but did not pull her. He waited. Poppy placed one hand on the ground, then another, and slowly worked herself through the opening. The room behind the viewing glass became so quiet that Rachel could hear the ventilation fan overhead. Poppy sat in a mulch for a moment as if deciding what to do next. Coda touched the ground beside her with his knuckles and moved away from the mound. That simple movement gave the staff what they needed. With Poppy clear, Rachel opened the route that allowed Nala back into the same section. Nala approached quickly, then slowed during the final few feet. Poppy moved toward her and disappeared against her mother's body. Coda remained nearby, facing away from them while Caleb watched Poppy's movement from a safe distance. She appeared alert and mobile, but the veterinary team would still examine her once normal transfer routines could resume. Then Coda did something almost comically ordinary. He walked toward the blue enrichment barrel. The same barrel he had ignored for hours was still near the platform. He turned it once, found nothing, and looked toward the ground until he discovered the forgotten piece of apple beside it. Lauren covered a smile with her hand. Her son whispered, he remembered. Rachel heard him and smiled too. Coda ate the apple, then sat in his usual shaded spot as if the long afternoon had finally released him. Before sunset, the staff completed a voluntary transfer of the gorilla group indoors. This time, when Rachel gave the familiar cue, Coda did not hesitate. He followed after Nala and Poppy, pausing only once at the doorway to glance toward the mound. The next morning, maintenance crews repaired the drainage area and added new barriers beneath the landscaping logs. Rachel arrived before the viewing area reopened. On the utility cart sat yesterday's transfer checklist and the face-down closure sign. She replaced the old wording with a simple notice explaining that part of the habitat was undergoing maintenance. When visitors began arriving, Lauren and her son were among them. They stood farther back from the glass than before. Coda eventually emerged with the group and crossed the repaired section without stopping. Poppy followed Nala several feet behind him. Near the blue barrel, Coda found a piece of lettuce, examined it, and continued walking. Poppy hurried over, picked it up, and sat down. Coda paused, glanced back at her, then settled into the grass nearby. Lauren's son raised his phone but did not immediately record. He simply watched. On the other side of the glass, Rachel did the same. By the end of the week, the repaired section of the habitat no longer looked unusual. Fresh mulch covered the disturbed soil, the drainage channel had been reinforced beneath the surface, and the heavy logs had been repositioned so there were no narrow pockets beneath them. Visitors passed the area without knowing exactly where Poppy had been trapped. Rachel knew the spot immediately. Each time she walked past the glass during her rounds, her eyes went there for half a second before returning to the gorillas. Coda rarely paid it any attention. Once the problem was gone, he seemed to have no reason to remain there. His familiar habits returned quietly. He searched through scattered vegetables, rested beneath the shade structure, and occasionally turned the blue enrichment barrel until something worth eating dropped out. Poppy returned to her own routines just as naturally. She stayed close to Nala at first, but within days her curiosity began carrying her farther across the habitat. Rachel noticed that Coda never followed her unnecessarily. He did not hover around her or behave as though the afternoon near the logs had created some new role for him. Most of the time, he seemed completely occupied with his own business. Then Poppy would wander toward an unfamiliar corner, and Coda's head would lift for just a moment before lowering again. Lauren and her son came back the following Saturday. This time they did not hurry toward the glass. They found a bench several yards away and watched from there. Lauren still had the original video on her phone, but she had never posted it. The first few seconds showed Coda striking the ground and turning toward the crowd. Without everything that came afterward, it told the wrong story. She watched the clip once more, then moved it into a private folder instead. Her son noticed. "Are you deleting it?" he asked. "No," Lauren said. "I just think it belongs to us." Across the habitat, Poppy had discovered the blue barrel. She pushed it awkwardly, followed it when it rolled downhill, then pushed again. Coda was sitting about 15 feet away with his back partly turned. The barrel bumped softly against a tree root and stopped. Poppy pulled at it, but it would not move. She changed sides and tried again. Lauren's son leaned forward, expecting Coda to intervene. He did not. Poppy eventually climbed over the root, found a piece of carrot beneath the barrel, and carried it away. Coda had watched the entire time without leaving his place. Rachel arrived near the viewing area carrying her morning clipboard. Lauren recognized her and gave a small wave. They spoke briefly about Poppy, who had been checked by the veterinary team and was doing well. There was little else to report, which seemed to please Rachel more than any dramatic update could have. Before returning to work, she looked toward Coda and said, almost to herself, "He is back to being Coda." Lauren understood what she meant. The extraordinary part had passed. What remained was simply an animal moving through an ordinary day. Late that afternoon, the crowd thinned as families headed toward the parking lot. Sunlight stretched across the grass, turning the viewing glass gold at its edges. Coda settled near the shade structure with a handful of leaves. Poppy wandered over and sat several feet from him. For a while, neither seemed interested in the other. Then Poppy shifted closer. Coda continued eating. She moved closer again until her shoulder rested lightly against his arm. He paused with a leaf between his fingers, glanced down at her, and resumed eating. There was no warning call, no hidden opening, no staff gathered around a monitor. Rachel passed the window, saw them, and kept walking. Lauren's son lowered the phone he had been holding and slipped it into his pocket. He did not need the recording. As they turned toward the exit, he looked back one last time. Poppy was still beside Coda, and Coda was still calmly sorting through the leaves in his hands. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.